Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Wednesdays with Watson podcast. You are listening to a donor-funded podcast. I cannot tell you how grateful I am for that. For those of you new to the podcast, our mission here is to help people via story. People that will talk about their journeys on the road of hope and healing where trauma is present. That is our mission, is to educate you and to share stories of hope and healing with you. Secondary to that mission is providing pro bono counseling for people that cannot afford it. And we are so honored to be able to do that with the donations that are coming into the podcast. If you would like to be part of that, all you have to do is click that Contact Amy button. There will be several ways for you to do that. We would love your support. Another way you can support the podcast is right there when you're in your app. Go ahead and rate and review us. Even if you don't like what you hear, we want to hear from you. The way that algorithms work is the more rates, the more reviews, the higher it will come up in the search engines of people who are looking for hope and healing. Today, I'm so excited to bring the second episode and the second half of Season 3. It is a season we are calling Trauma, Spaces, Places, and Aces. And so in the podcast before this, and you can go back and listen to that if you want, it is in the show notes, but I spent a fair amount of time really educating on some trauma terms and introducing the place that we are going to be talking about that, and that is trauma in the home, and the space is childhood trauma. Today's guest is Sherrie Pilkington, host of the Finding God in Our Pain podcast. Sherrie is a podcasting friend of mine, and if we're ever in the same city together, we might need some bail money. But she has a story of continued redemption and healing to share with you guys, and I can't wait for you to hear it. So let's dive into this conversation with my friend, Sherrie Pilkington. And first of all, Sherrie, I hope I said your name properly. Did I do that?
You did really well, actually, because I get a lot of different variations of that, but you nailed it.
Well, welcome to the podcast. I have here with me, speaking of last names, a humdinger of a last name, my co-host, Chrissy Lothridge. Chrissy Lothridge, this has just become normal for us. Say hey to the people.
Hey to the people.
Hey, Chrissy.
Sherrie, I would love to formally introduce you to the podcast. As I mentioned, you and I met at a podcasting event, Pod Move in Nashville. I think that we all agree that those podcasting events are more for the social aspect of it than for the learning aspect of it. And
Agreed.
I sat down on a bus beside you after a party that iHeartRadio, shout out iHeart, had for PodMove 2021 in Nashville. And before you even opened your mouth, I knew there was something special about you. There's just something very special that suffering does to us.
Mm.
And so I knew that I wanted this day to come when I would have you on my podcast. And so to formally introduce you, you are the host of your own podcast called Finding God in Your Pain. And unlike me, people know what your podcast is about by the title. So that is why you're here today, because you have and continue to find God in your pain. You are the mom of 2 and probably would have chosen this first, but the grandmother of 2 as well.
Grandmother to 5.
Grandmother of 5. How did I forget that? Okay, grandmother of 5. Wow. So
and my youngest and his wife are talking about having more, so I'm excited.
Well, yeah, I bet you are. Yeah, most parents say that they would have them first. Well, thank you for being here. But let's just jump right in. So this is a season. We spent the first half of the season speaking about an ACE that it talks about trauma. And so you are my first guest in the second half of it. And we've asked the same question. This is one of Chrissy's questions to everybody. And so I'm not going to steal it from you, Chris. You get the first question to our esteemed guests here today.
All right. I love asking this question. What is your favorite thing about how God made you?
Funny, when you guys gave me a heads up on that question, I thought you got a lot of wisdom with that, because people who come from a background of trauma sometimes have a hard time answering questions that give a personal identity to them. So it did stump me, and I did have to give some thought to it and process it with the Lord. And ultimately what I came down to is that I am very grateful for the fact that God has made me, unoffended. I am not easily offended. And I believe that is such a gift to have, because I can let people be people and I'm not keeping score or worried about what somebody else is doing or trying to be over in somebody else's yard judging them. And so I feel like that's just a sliver of gold for me that I'm extremely grateful for.
And true. Just a little bit that I know about you, true. It is so true. And Chrissy, what a great point when she said that people who have trauma are going to struggle to answer this question. Did that ever occur to you as we've been asking it?
It hasn't occurred to me, but it makes a lot of sense, and I'm really glad we're asking it because I've had to answer it. I know it's hard, and it forces you to look at the good of what God has done instead of, oh, I wish I had, I wish I did, I wish. And so I like it for that reason.
Yeah, and it really pushes us into this bigger question, do we even believe in a God or a creator, right? And so we could talk about that forever. I love that answer, and by the way, that's one of my favorite things about you too. Well, as I mentioned, we took some time on the podcast episode before this one to talk about some terms that we hear when we discuss trauma. Because most people, Sherrie, think when they hear trauma that you have to be a Vietnam vet or something, and so and it comes with this stigma, right? And so that episode, while you don't have to listen to it to understand this one, the one before this does talk about that, and it does accomplish my goal of educating you guys about trauma and what it means. In doing that, I decided to add a term that's fancy in the psychological world called adverse childhood experiences, since we are focusing on childhood trauma. And it's a thing. So listeners out there, if you just Google adverse childhood experiences, you're going to get way more information than you ever want. And you're also going to get a quiz, because this is a widely accepted measurement of how much a child's developing brain is affected by different types of trauma. And it's 10 categories. And so, Sherrie, you and I processed this, and I've really loved doing this. We've processed this episode on Voxer, which, for those of you that don't know what that is, just an audio app. Sherrie and I are talking back and forth, and we're growing in the Lord together, and we're coming to aha moments and all the things. And I thought for sure when I asked you this question, you were going to say, no, I'm not doing that at all. You're not allowed to do that. But I asked you if I could rapid fire these 10 questions at you. And so listeners, these 10 questions help the experts know what level, if you will, of trauma that a child has experienced, because they then can clinically, with all the studies and all the things, kind of within a range understand how a child is going to be affected. So these are rapid fire questions. You are so brave, probably the bravest guest I've ever had on this one. So these are the 10 general adverse childhood experiences recognized in the psychological world as going to affect you as an adult, which is our point here. Here we go. Rapid fire. Ready?
Yes or no answers?
Yes or no answer, my friend, because
Okay.
we're going to have plenty of time to talk, I promise. All right. Did you experience physical abuse in your home as a child?
Yes.
I don't know. I'm going to get through this without crying. Did you experience sexual abuse in your home?
No, I did not.
You did not. Did you experience verbal abuse?
Yes.
Physical neglect?
Yes.
Emotional neglect?
Yes.
Substance abuse?
No.
Okay. Incarcerated relative?
No.
Domestic violence?
Yes.
Divorce?
Yes.
Mental illness?
Yes.
Okay. So I was doing the math in my head. I think it's a 6 or 7. Your score's a 6 or a 7.
Okay.
And so let's talk about what that means. Okay.
All right.
So the Pine Tree Institute, which is just one of many people who deal with these adverse childhood experiences. Before we get there, though, Chrissy, you had something you wanted to ask here that you think is going to be advantageous to other listeners. Can you pop that question in here for me?
Yeah. So when I'm looking at those, they're very specific, and so I wondered if underlying things like if a parent has cancer and there's the threat of them dying, or someone outside of the nuclear family threatens a family member, so that type of thing that maybe isn't quite in here. I don't even know where you'd put any of those in there, but they would be real and large and affecting the childhood experience.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you you adding that in here, because what I don't want is for people to hear Sherrie's episode today and go, well, I only have one of those, and so I'm fine. I'm fine. I don't need any help. And so, Chrissy, your question speaks to something very, very interesting, especially coming from you. The way you just phrased that question is, do other things that threaten the security of the child, whether it be a sick parent, a suicidal parent, or whatever, that threatens that Maslow's hierarchy of needs: food, shelter, water, sleep, rest. Yes, is the answer to your question. Okay. And so the experts say if you have a score between 1 through 3 without a physical adverse childhood experience, and so if physical abuse is one of them, then you already get pushed into the next category. 1 through 3, you're moderately likely to have some toxic stress moving into adulthood, and we're going here somewhere with this, I promise, guys. So you blew that out of the water, Sherrie. So did I. Okay, so anything above a 3, so from 3 to 10, you are 100% likely to experience toxic stress through your life. Your body, your brain, the child's developing brain is also experiencing that toxic stress, and so there are damages that happen as a result of it with a score higher than 4.
Can you explain what toxic stress means?
Yeah, so toxic stress, we talked about a little bit on the episode before this. That's a really good question, Chrissy. Toxic stress is stress that affects us at the cellular level. And this is where epigenetics comes in. We talked about that in the episode before this too. But yes, Chrissy, when we experience toxic stress at the cellular level, at the DNA level, that DNA is actually altered, and the way it works or doesn't work. This is why we get we get diseases and autoimmune issues and all the stuff when we see childhood trauma, because it affects us on a basic level. It's not just your normal stressed out in traffic stress. It's toxic stress. It's exactly the word you think. Think of a toxic dump in your brain, and then what it does to a child's brain. And so that is, stress is not always a bad thing, but so Sherrie, at a score of 6 or 7 there, I wonder something. What would have happened, you think, if you would have known this information 30 years ago?
Wow. It would have empowered me to find peace faster, to walk in freedom, and to pursue the calling on my life. I feel like that's 3 areas that I could have definitely, right off the top of my head, I definitely could have benefited from had I known the impact of cellular level damage.
Right. And we're going to get to parenting later, but Chrissy, how do you think you would be different if you would have known?
I would have more grace for myself and for my responses to things, because I'm typically going to beat myself up for why is that affecting me? Why don't I feel good today? Any number of things, but understanding that this is traumatic and you have a reason, and it would give me the freedom to give myself some grace.
And Amy, something that you just said, it reminds me of an incident that I'm watching today with someone that I know, and there is there's physical abuse in the home, there's domestic violence, there are fits of rage from a parent, and I'm watching the smallest one, who is a toddler, but he has endured this since he was an infant, and now he has fits of rage, and his identity is in question, and he's gravitating to the parent that he wants the most attention from. And so I'm looking at all of this, because I don't think trauma has to be a car accident or even get to that physical,
right.
All of those things to that level when you're an infant and a toddler. I think in the environment, it would appear to me that in the environment, they are absorbing these things. They have no ability to process. They have no point of reference to understand, but yet they are taking on all of this that they're seeing and hearing and experiencing in front of them.
100%. And I'm different, because if somebody, like a quiz, gives me a reason to feel like I feel, to her point just now with freedom, it's like, oh, okay, well, there's a reason for me to feel some of these things. But to your point though, Sherrie, the more we understand this, and this is the point, we could stop trauma begetting trauma and stop the generational curse. Exodus 4 tells us that the second, third, and fourth generation. And so just understanding adverse childhood experiences, and I'm using that term interchangeably with trauma because there's people out there that says, I don't have trauma, but I had some of those adverse childhood experiences. And so had I known this information a long time ago, I would have not ended up in a lot of places. I ended up doing a lot of things I did because I just didn't understand what I didn't understand. And so for those of you listening out there, and the other thing I want to do here is I don't want to freak parents out thinking you've screwed up your kids, because we're all going to make mistakes, but the trauma or the adverse childhood experience at the cellular level, like Sherrie just gave an example of, this child is not only watching it, but is absorbing it. And we know this because babies don't even get hunger pains. They feel uncomfortable, they cry, the need is met, we're good. But when we talk about trauma at the most basic level, and we're talking about the baby throwing the bottle on the floor, baby's uncomfortable, cries, parent ignores, cries a little bit more, parent ignores more. Finally, crying doesn't do me anything, so I'm just going to be uncomfortable. And their brains, to your point, Sherrie, are absorbing that. And so as we move into your story, though, I would love to know more about some of your questions, Chrissy, for Sherrie too.
Well, one of the questions you listed, one of the ACEs you listed, was mental illness in the home. Can you share a little bit more about the mental illness in the home where you grew up?
Sure. My mother, we later discovered she was diagnosed with bipolar, but who was talking about bipolar situations or conditions back in the 60s, 70s, and very early 80s? No one that I knew of. I'd never heard of that term. And the other thing is, we never got her clinically diagnosed, but my siblings and I have a brother and a sister, picked up on these personalities. She had a second personality that was childlike. And while she did not get diagnosed, we were still subject to those personalities. And again, we wouldn't have termed it that way when we were younger. We just couldn't understand why you couldn't get through to her. She would be acting like a child or laughing like a child or ridiculing. And you'd try, like, Mom, what are you doing? And then she would not acknowledge you. So it was just very strange. And so we just try to get out of the room because we didn't understand what we were supposed to be doing. So she had that bipolar condition where you just did not know which end was up. You did not know what personality you were going to get, and you didn't know whether today was going to be an okay day. Maybe I used the indoor broom on the outdoor porch, and so that was all wrong. And then, but yesterday I did it and I was fine. Or the way I washed the dishes was okay today, but it's not okay the next day. So it was, the way that I describe my childhood is that I never had anywhere solid to rest my feet. And that's contributed to issues that I grew. You know how when you're trying to make sense of something, I was just speaking about this child I know. So you're trying to make sense of something that you have no point of reference for. So what do? You conjure up your own lens of looking at life and trying to function in what you've experienced, but don't know how to process it.
Because like you said, you have no context for it. Right? You have zero context. Like, as far as you knew, everybody else's houses were like that too.
True.
Yeah.
And Chrissy, often, one of the things why this works so much, and you said this, Chrissy, in my episode that you interviewed me, like, our childhoods couldn't be any different. And so you don't know what you don't know, and so I have a question that I didn't prep you for, but it's easy for you to answer because I'm just curious. Where are you in the birth order?
I am the middle child, the one that's overlooked and ignored.
The one that's
Actually, it wasn't me. I was kind of mouthy, so I didn't hide, but it was my sister who got looked over, really. She really did she stayed out of a lot of trouble, but was in trouble. She was doing stuff she should have gotten in trouble for, but because she was just ignored.
Younger or older than you?
Younger.
Gotcha.
Yes, she is younger. I have an older brother. My brother is 1 year older. My sister is 2 years younger.
The reason I ask you that question is because, and we'll talk about this through this episode, is we see a lot of children turning into caretakers in homes like yours. And it's interesting to me that you're a middle child because normally you see that in the older child. But finally you were like, I'm going to leave this house. I know at some point, but I don't know when. And you said something to me, I don't even think you said to me, is I needed to make sure my mom was okay, and I needed to make sure my sister was okay. And it fired off all these things in my head, because that is so typical in these traumatic homes where that are not healthy, where you became the adult. So during our prep interview, you said something to me that I want to highlight here. I want to ask a question before that. How old were you when you left home? And then tell us why you finally left home.
I left home at 18 because I had just graduated, because on each last day of the year, school year, it would be my birthday. So I had just turned 18. And I'll say a couple of months later, so when I turned 18, I was planning to get out of there, but I got kicked out before I could leave on my own.
And you told me you didn't remember why.
But I cannot tell you what I got kicked out. I do not remember why. And it could have been that I used the wrong washcloth for the dishes. I don't know. It was just that random and that unpredictable. So it could have very well been, but she had kicked my brother out. So now it was my turn to get kicked out. And then, of course, my sister coming up behind me as soon as she graduated, and she graduated at 17, she got kicked out.
Wow. Yeah, there's a pause there for a reason, because that just even makes me shake my head. Ugh, I'm so sorry.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And then my dad, who's never in the picture, he shows up to pick me up. I was like, wow, okay, cool.
Okay. One of the things you mentioned to Amy in the prep, you left your house with survival skills, but no relationship skills. Can you expound on that a little bit?
I would not have termed it that way when I first left the house. All I could think of is, I want to get out of here. I was already preparing to leave. She just got to me before I could get out the door. And I left the house feeling like, finally, I'm getting ready to live my life. I do not have her hanging over my head, but I did not realize that the lens with which I had created in order to survive in that atmosphere, that condition, that environment, was what was going to equip me for later, because it did not equip me at all. When I was outside of that environment, the skills that I had created did not serve me well at all in relationships with people who had no attachment to that type of abuse or understanding of who I was or what I'd been through. So yeah, I ran headlong into a wall, but not really realizing it first, because the time that I went for counseling, I wouldn't have said it was my survival skills. I would have said somebody else is making my life difficult. That's what I would have responded to. I didn't make the connection that I had to take responsibility for that, which kind of backtracks a little bit to your point. That was one thing that I could have been equipped with, was taking responsibility for my life in a way that would have produced a much more mature and beneficial lifestyle with relationships and whatnot.
Except you understand that there's no way that could have happened, right? Because you did not have it modeled for you. And so for you to take responsibility for something would be like somebody asking me to send Chrissy to the moon.
Yeah. You don't have the skill set.
So I want you to give yourself grace that Chrissy just talked about. Like, had you understood what you've been through 30 years ago, you would have walked out and next time I see you, I'll give you a big giant hug and give you a big pat on the back and say, you made it. It was those survival skills that made you make it. And I did the same thing. I aged out of the system at 18, went to college, and we're not here to talk about my story, but I did the same thing. And here's the issue, listeners, and Chrissy can even speak to this a little bit. The problem with those of us who have incredible survival skills is that those skills is a skill that the world denominates or pays us in the thing that matters, right? So survival skills are, I'm going to run, I'm not going to quit. Something knocked me down, fine, I'll get back in. And the world absolutely rewards that with the green folding stuff. And so why would we want any other skill? But I want to speak into you. There's no way you could have learned or known to take responsibility for your actions. However, there is a point where, and I tell Chrissy this all the time, and one of the reasons why I do the podcast is because my power company doesn't care that I had trauma. They care that I write them a check. So we gotta, even though it's not fair, those of us with these stories have got to do the thing. But most of us, before we do the thing, do a bunch of other things in between. So you turned 18, you left your house. Tell us about what happened then.
When I left my house, I was determined to I had a job. I just got a job. So I had the job, but I needed a car and I needed an apartment somewhere else to stay. I wasn't going to stay in the area where my mom was at. I was going to go back to an old neighborhood, or at least in that area where I had gone to school with people prior to moving where we were. And so when I went back there, I just wanted an apartment, a car, and a job. That was all I was worried about. Wasn't worried about dating, none of that stuff. And so I connected up with a friend of mine who she and I had gone to school and just started to hang out with her. And so one night we were out dancing, and her friend, she knew a friend. Let me see if I can get this right. One of her friends showed up and she introduced me to him. And then the guy in tow with him, he introduced us to all of us. So then we hung out for like 10 months because I was not interested. He kept asking me to date. I saw him dating other people, wasn't interested. Just fine. Have yourself a good time. We enjoyed dancing. Him and I usually ended up on the floor longer than anybody else. And then we'd all go to dinner or breakfast at Denny's or whatever. And then we'd all go our separate ways. Well, I went my separate way. I can't speak for everybody else, but again, I just was finally, he asks me out one more time. And he's just like, I just really wish you'd go out with me. We have a lot of fun. And I just think we would make a really great couple, something along those lines. He goes, but I don't have as much fun with you as I have with other people. So I was like, okay, all right, whatever. So we go out, and the fun just continued, and we connected on humor before we even started dating. Our relationship was built on humor. The marriage, when we'd have tough times, we were together a little over 33 years. We laughed through some of the hard parts, or just found some common ground of humor, dumb, stupid humor that, couples share, and, nicknames you call each other, things like that. And so that kept us going. Even to this day, what I miss the most about him is his humor.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. So we've not really talked about God yet at all. When you got married, were you walking with the Lord, and was Larry a Christian?
Funny thing, and I don't know if funny is the right word because it's really not laughable, but I got saved at 13. And I credit one of my aunts for modeling who God was in a realistic way, and for continually drawing us into a relationship with God. She played the piano, and when you were at her house, she was extremely generous, and she, fed you and sang hymns with you. I love the hymns. I grew up on the hymns because of her. And so her modeling who God was always in the back of my mind, because I was getting mixed signals and mixed messages at home. I mean, they would talk about God, but ain't nobody really relying on God. And we'd only go to church when things were really bad, like Dad had left us or something. Then we'd go to church. So it was a lot of mixed messages. But Rainey, her name was Lorraine, and we called her Aunt Rainey, was very consistent. So I came to the knowledge of Christ at 12 years old, professed him as my Lord and Savior, or as salvation. But then he later becomes the Lord of my life, because, you can have salvation, but not really make him the Lord of your life. And that was always a saving grace for me, if you will, because once I was saved, I began to read the word. I did not understand it. I probably read the word through 3 or 4 times, the whole Bible through 3 or 4 times between 12 and leaving the house at 18. It's not so much that I walked with the Lord. I just felt his presence. I felt I had this underlying feeling that what was going on was not right, and to hang on. And not that anybody told me that, but except that, I'm praying and I'm reading the word. And when I was hanging out with my friends, I was desperate to go anywhere because Mom wouldn't let you go anywhere. She didn't like you answering the phone. She didn't want you to go anywhere. And when I finally got a chance to go somewhere, we were probably doing stuff we shouldn't be doing. But so it's not like I was walking with the Lord, but I knew his presence. And so when I leave home, strangely enough, I left the Lord. He had been so good, so kind, so faithful to me. But for some reason, I walked out the door going, okay, now I got to make this happen. I got to do life. So no, I was not walking with the Lord. I gave my husband no reason to believe I was a believer at all. And he was not a believer at the time that we got married.
So tell us about the journey of so you got married. Actually, before I ask that question, I do want to ask you something, because I think this is more for the listeners out there. So when you left home, you walked away from the Lord. I did something similar. I got, and I'm air quoting when I say this, church hurt. I stopped going to church, and I wasn't a bad kid. But there's a question I want to ask you, and this is really for those of you listening. A lot of women, especially, who have been through what you and I have been through and what listeners have been through, because their brain didn't develop properly and attachment disorders and all the things. We find a lot of promiscuity. We find a lot of partying. We find a lot of drug abuse. We find a lot of that. Was that ever part of your story before you met and married Larry?
Not a lot, but when I was in high school, I had a boyfriend who was not in school. As a matter of fact, he was like, I guess, please tell me that all of us have a bomb magnet in our pocket during high school or something like that, because I dated a guy who was not in school. He was on probation, for Pete's sake. Yes. What was I thinking? I do not know. But anyway, it gave me an excuse not to date the guys in school because I was scared to death. Mom's idea of abstinence, or at least teaching you about relationship, was get pregnant and you'll need to find somewhere else to live because you're not living here. So that's my introduction to sex ed, if you will, as far as being, careful when you're on a date. So all I can think of is, oh crap, I can't, no, how do you prevent all that? Okay, well, I'm just not going to date. But I do end up having sex with the guy, but I was so guilt ridden. And I didn't know, it's not that I felt like I was raped. I don't. But I didn't know how to say no. I didn't know I had a voice. I didn't know that I had options, that you could speak up and that somebody would actually listen to you. And so I ended up having sex with him, but it's like 3 or 4 times. And I'm like, I can't do, he wasn't using any sort of protection. So I'm like, I'm out of here. I can't do this. I do not want to end up pregnant. Oh my gosh, not to you. But, so yeah. Yeah, I mean, at least I had some sense, I guess, just thinking, dude, you're like the wrong guy. So I break up with him, and then I date a few other guys. And of course, I don't know what it is. Maybe this is not the right thing to say, but it was my experience. My country guys were more respectable than my city guys. My city guys really pushed the limits. So I was able to maintain abstinence, although my friend says oral sex and all is still sex. So maybe there was some promiscuity.
So there was some of those behaviors, because I know when I aged out of the system and walked away from the Lord, really, is when I wasn't promiscuous, but I married somebody who was not a Christian, which I had been taught my whole life, right along with, hellfire and brimstone, marry a Christian, hellfire and brimstone, marry a Christian. And John was not a Christian, and I paid for that for a very, very long time. In our prep, you told me that Larry was not a Christian. I would love, and I think Chrissy would love to know this too, because I'm kind of asking your question. Tell me about yours and Larry's spiritual journey.
Okay, that I will. If I misunderstood your question prior to that and put myself out on Front Street, maybe you'll forgive me for that. But
no, okay. You didn't. No.
Okay. Our journey. Okay, Larry was tender-hearted. He really was a tender-hearted guy. He liked to act like he was, he was tough and nothing really bothered him. But he was a very tender-hearted guy. And so as I began to talk about the Lord, and of course, I am flipping the script. In his book, I am flipping the script on him because he has no reason to believe I'm a Christian, but now I'm married and now I want to live the Christian life. And he's like, wait, hold on a second. No, what are you doing? So that is when this lens of how I had created life really got under the heat, if you will, because he's the one I'm doing life with every day. And now I'm discovering under this pressure that, wait, my skills aren't working here. I'm doing nothing but creating strife in this marriage. And he's got his heels dug in and he's not giving up, because rightfully so, right? I'm one way before we're married, and then I want to be another way after we get married.
You baited and switched him, Sherrie. You baited and
I did.
switched him.
I mean, I did. I really did. Not my intention. And even thinking about back in when I was younger and swearing. I swear I will never let her make me cry again. I will never cry. I swear. And I even had to repent for that later, because I didn't understand that when you're swearing like that and taking on these oaths, they cost you something. And so I had to later repent for that and to release those types of things and even those types of attitudes. So he does eventually come to the knowledge of Christ. We were at some play. It was like a hellfire and brimstone type production by one of the churches, and he goes forward. Now, did his walk immediately take ground? No, it did not. There was that whole struggle between soul and spirit, and what the soul already knew, what the spirit is trying to redeem, and there's that whole struggle. So it wasn't a perfect walk, but then again, who has the perfect walk, right? But it did take him a while, and I would even venture to say that in the last 4, last 4 years of his life, that was the strongest I had ever seen him walking with regard to the people that he put himself in, like on a constant basis, pastors and strong Christian men. And he was leading people to the Lord. He was so cute, though. He would talk to them about why they needed Jesus and why he was such a good man, a good God to know. And then he would bring, like, hey, come over here. They want to accept. You need to lead them to the Lord. Like, I wasn't quite confident enough to say the prayer, of confession, or I don't know, confession, but the prayer of repentance. That's what I'm looking for.
That's so awesome, because it means that you brought God into your home, right?
Yeah. He was looking at me going, girl, you're a hot mess. You want to try this now, but let's go. Come on.
In your opinion, how has your adverse childhood experience colored the way you parent? Can you share with listeners how, if you had any struggles parenting since you didn't have that modeled for you?
It's a great question.
Yeah. It did not even breach my train of thought until I was pregnant. I found out I was pregnant. And then I was like, holy moly, I'm going to have a baby. I have no clue how to do this. No clue. And I became even more afraid of repeating because I did not understand. Right. We didn't know anything about bipolar. We didn't know anything about dual or multi personalities. And so I'm like, this is terrifying me. But it is also the ground in which God showed me who he was as a parent to me. He showed me the difference between discipline for the purpose of correction and abuse. So then I was like, okay, that's abuse. That's what I was experiencing. I also put things in place because I did not want to somehow become her and not realize it. And one time I broke my rules. So my rules were maximum, because we did paddle, but it was a maximum of 3. And they could be fully clothed, because a lot of times we had to have bare legs or a bare butt. So they could be fully clothed, maximum 3. Could not do it when I was mad, because if she was mad, she would just get on you and not let up until she felt better. And what else did I have? It was a last resort. We had tried everything else. We had like a strike 3 system. There were things that you lost, or privileges you lost, or time that you spent without friends, that kind of thing. And so it was the last resort. One time I broke my rule. I paddled my son when I was mad. And God corrected me immediately. I go back into my room, because I'd been in his room. I go back to my room and my hand was hurting. And I looked down at my hand, it had blood on my hand. I absolutely panicked. I ran back into the room. I said, son, let me see your legs, because he had one of his dad's t-shirts on. See, I thought that was enough. Again, didn't make sure his legs were covered. So when I lifted his shirt, there was nothing on his legs, not marks, not anything. So I had at least caught the shirt. But what I also caught was my hand when I did it, and it made me bleed and it made me hurt. And so the Lord corrected me. I went in, got on my knees, laid on the floor. Laid on the bed, across the bed, just repented to the Lord, because he had already shown me how to correct for the purpose, discipline for the purpose of correction. And I did not do it. And so I never did that after. Made sure that those 3 things were in place.
Wow.
And it's just being that father, him showing me how he cares for me as a father, and understanding his heart for me by the way that I felt about my children. That was super powerful for me. That was transforming for me.
And that is something, I'm just speaking for myself, that I wish I could take to heart a little bit better, is God as my father. Because as my counselor so often says, Sherrie, the way you parented your children, you shouldn't be able to do that. And we go back again to Exodus 34, where the trauma and the sins of the father the Bible says the second, the third, the fourth generation. And so with only Jesus, and I say that really tongue in cheek, because on this podcast, Jesus is the star of the story. And for you to be able to answer that question like you did, and that your children were seemingly normal, I think it probably depends on what day you ask that question to them. Right. But you shouldn't have been able to do that. And I'm grateful to the star of the story. Yeah. We've alluded a couple times, and listeners are probably hanging on by a thread. You're moving along in life. You have 2 children. You're married. You're growing in your faith. Marriage not without its issues. Went to counseling, which is another thing that we really focus on in this podcast. Then life changed forever. Please tell us why and how.
Had no indication whatsoever. When he left that morning, February 21st, 2018, everything seemed fine. Gave each other a kiss, hug, call me later, love you. Yes, I'll call you later. So everything seemed pretty normal. And then about, I'm going to guess around 10:30, he calls me to say, hey, I'm sick. I don't feel good. I'm going to go try to eat. But if I can't eat, I'm going to go home. And I said, okay, well, I have one more stop to make. And then I will, or no, at that point I said, call me, let me know. And so at about 11, he says, I feel worse. I want to throw up. So I'm going to go home. And that's when I said, all right, I have one more stop. I will go to the grocery store and I'll pick up some ginger ale and crackers and soup in case you start feeling better. I'm still mad at myself to this day because he's never sick. And so why didn't I pick up on anything? It's not like it was flu season, or at least we had, again, it could have been flu season. He's just never sick. Well, about 11:30, we get a call. My son gets a call from a friend, and he's told that your dad's been in an accident. I've called the ambulance. Let your mom know. So my son calls me, and I didn't pick up on it, but he's in shock. I didn't pick up on it. And he says, Mom, Dad's been in an accident. Do you want me to go? If he'd have been in his right mind, he'd have gone. There was no way he wouldn't have asked me that. And I said, let me go check, sweetheart. I know he didn't feel good. Maybe he clipped somebody, because our roads are very narrow out here. And my mind is not processing the fact that I don't know where maybe your mind goes into this place of protection, I guess, or at least that's the only thing that makes sense to me. And I said, no, honey, don't worry about it. I'll ride out there right now. I'm getting ready to head home. I got to go to the grocery store, but I'll just go check on him. As I'm going out there, I try to call him and he doesn't answer. I'm thinking, oh man, this is probably, I wonder if it's a bad accident. So then I try to call again and I'm like, oh, I need you to call me, and I left that on the, and I thought, oh, what if he got into a head on? Like, what if he was throwing up and he got into a head on accident? So then I'm starting to panic. Well, about that time, my son, the same son, the youngest one, calls me and says, Mom, I told Mary, which is, I don't know if she was his fiance. No, it would have been his wife at that point. I called Mary and asked her to go out there because she was close by. I said, okay. So I call her. I said, Mary, let me speak to Larry. And so she hesitates. And I said, you all right? And she goes, yeah. Now you got to remember, she's like 22 and she's having to process this. She already knows it's not good. And I am on the other end saying, let me speak to him. And what is she going to tell me, right? She doesn't even know, right? She's never dealt with anything like this before. Her father is dead. And she's having to wonder what she's going to tell me. She was very close to him. He loved her. And so now she's having to look at that, watch all that go down. So she says, I can't. And I said, why not? And she goes, well, because the ambulance is, with him. And I said, well, ask the ambulance if I can talk to him. I'm still, again, I think your brain just goes to an area where you're like not
you're in shock.
Engaged in what's going on. And I hear her say, can she speak to him? Now he's on a respirator at this point. I don't know this, but I later learned that and they're like, no, we're trying to, and then I didn't hear anything. And so she goes, well, they're trying to stabilize him. Okay. That's when it kicks in for me. I said, my voice raises, stabilize. What do you mean stabilize? Tell them to define stabilize right now. Like that. And so that poor child asks for stable. What do you mean by stabilize? Now she's watching them work on this man, that she loves dearly and he loved her. And so she's trying, poor thing. I wonder if I've ever apologized to that baby for having done that to her in that moment. And she says, well, they're trying to stabilize him because they're trying to make his heart beat or something like that. Okay, that's when I totally lose it in the sense that I'm like, what hospital are they going to? And she's like, well, we're right on the line between Chesapeake and Virginia Beach. So they're arguing about what hospital to take him. I said, you tell them to take him to Princess Anne and I will see you there now. And she goes, okay, I will. And so I'm calling people, look, you have got to pray. Larry has been in a car. I still think it's a car accident. I don't know that he's had a heart attack. So I'm trying to process all that. I get to long story short, I guess I've gone on long enough, is that I get to the hospital. They pull us, my sons and I pull us into a room. I'm waiting for them to come tell me I can see him. My heart is still hanging on to that. And walks this white coat, little petite doctor. And I'm like, she does not have it in her to tell me what I do not want to hear. But sure enough, she opens her mouth and out comes. We've done everything we can. There's nothing left. Well, I start arguing with her. You could still be in there trying to do something. Have you tried everything? How do you know you've tried everything? So I'm like, poor woman, I'm bullying her because I will not take her answer for the final answer. I got one son who's collapsed. I got one son who's beside me with his arm around me, and I'm still arguing with this woman. So long story short, I did not get to see him like I thought I would, or at least when I did see him, it was in the hospital and it was on a steel gurney, but it was not the way I had hoped to see him.
Yeah, I want to let that breathe for a second because it's the third or fourth time I've heard it, and I'm so sorry, and I would be sorry to anybody that experiences that, but particularly today on this interview, it makes my heart sad because it's sad. But you just got done talking to our listeners about how God has been your father, and he really is the reason why you raised your kids like you did and all the things. But now, here's this reality that you're living in. And I can't help but wonder, did you ever feel abandoned by God? And let me expound on that a little bit more, because this is the desire of your heart, Sherrie, for this podcast. Because you said to me, I wonder if the way I responded to Larry's passing, I responded as though he abandoned me. I was mad at him that he abandoned me. And I'm here to tell you, with my not-so-psychology degree, but Google and a little bit of a brain, that's absolutely your childhood trauma, that abandonment. Now your husband leaves you.
And not of his free will. He leaves you, but that logic leaves in those moments, and I can only imagine your childhood came home to roost.
Satan attaches himself to our traumas, and he uses every opportunity that he can to bring them back up to us. But the beauty of a relationship, a personal and intimate relationship with Christ, is that when Satan brings those things up to us, like he did with abandonment, we have God who wants to heal them. I believe that when we're under pressure, when we're under that fire, and those things in us come up, then that's God wanting to say, give me that child, give me that daughter. I want to work that out for you. I want to heal that place for you. I want to bring in my peace, my healing, and my salve for that pain that this world has put on you. I have something different for you. I have a different value system for you. And that's really what happened to me here. My husband would have picked divorce to abandon me versus checking out at 52 years old, because he was very much a family man. He loved his boys. The grandbabies were starting to come. He was the youngest of 8 babies. He loved babies. So I know when you look at it in a realistic way, then yeah, he did not abandon me. That is not the truth.
Right.
But did it come up in my spirit, in my soul? Yes, it did. And then pardon me, I even told the Lord, I'm a little exhausted with this whole abandonment thing. I don't really want to go back and process this again, but God heals in layers. And so he said to me, Sherrie, I don't take you back to hurt you. I take you back to heal you. And so when he said that to me, I was like, all right, let's go. What have you got? How do you want to rewrite this lie that I have embraced in my life to the point that it would come up in this way that it is not the truth, but yet it seems to be the truth.
Yeah.
And so God brings those things up, or at least he's right there when they do come up.
Right. And I think that, because one of my next questions is, and you just really answered it eloquently, is what would you say to people who are 18, 28, 38, 48, 58, who have childhood traumas and then experience trauma later in life, and those are they're the same, right? But they're different. I have a huge fear of abandonment. This one right here, and I told you this story on Voxer, but for listeners, Chrissy and I were running errands one day, and she needed gas, and I needed something from the bank, and I needed to go into the lockbox. Make a very long story short, I came out of the bank, she wasn't there, and I was convinced that she had left me and was never coming back to get me. And I was 36 or 37 years old. So listeners, I'm honing in on that because that I want you to understand that if you've experienced childhood trauma, you've got real issues, physical issues with your brain. And so it's so important for parents, teachers, youth pastors, all of them, anyone who has agency over a child to understand how important the developing brain is and how they will experience trauma later. I am so grateful that you just spoke life into people by just saying, you know what? God heals our pain in layers. That even took my breath away a little bit, and it's helping me understand why my pain is being healed in layers. So, yeah, thank you for that so much.
Yeah, what really came to mind for me is what Satan meant for evil, God meant for good. And so that bringing up the abandonment again is Satan's way of going, ha ha ha. And God was like, oh, bring it. I got more healing to do. Yeah, go for it. Yeah. And so it's always encouraging to me when God turns the tables on Satan and his tricks. And so
God turns the table on Satan and his tricks. That's a Lutheragism, y'all. That is fantastic.
I was going to say, that's a table to flip, right?
That is a table to flip.
Well, as we close out the podcast, what shouldn't we do when we are doing life closely with someone who has experienced what you have? What has not been helpful?
You know, my first initial response to that is that I don't know that I would put that on someone else. And what I mean by that is when I'm triggered, when I go through things that pertain to my childhood experiences, would it be helpful if someone understood that? But how can they if they haven't been through it, or if they're not even relating to the fact that this is it? Because a lot of times that was my situation. I didn't put the pieces together. When I think about this child that I've made reference to, I think about the journey that this child is on and the heartache and the possible identity issues as this child grows older. But what if this child knew? What if this child knew what had happened and then could get help immediately? So my point is, I think the burden of responsibility falls on me in order to get the help I need when I'm triggered. Can kind-hearted people make a difference? Oh, yeah. Can patient people make a difference? Oh, yeah. But
what do you say to the name it, claim it, you got a problem, I got a Bible verse? So you're walking along life with people with trauma. How do you experience the name it, claim it, misused, even dare I say weaponizing the gospel? That's how I would have answered that question, is we can't throw words that people may not even believe at them and expect them to do something like overnight unless God tells that story.
I agree. I can say scripture all day long, and I do believe that the word is powerful and it will transform anything and everything. It also transcends this life into the next life. So I'm not trying to take anything away from the word. But if there is no intimate and personal relationship with the word, and the word being Christ, then there is no change unless you engage God over that word. And that's going to be a process. And it makes me think about, there is a process to this. I would tell anyone to not rush the process of having this hard conversation with God and asking these tough questions, like, where were you? Did you even care? Or whatever is a tough question for that individual person. So I would say, get in there and get real with God. You ain't fooling him about anything anyway. So just lay it on the lay all your cards on the table, because change starts. I don't know if you remember when God asked Jacob, what's your name? It's not like he didn't know Jacob's name. He's like, you want to be honest with me now? If you can be honest with me, then we got somewhere to go. But if you want to keep avoiding me.
That is a fantastic take on that scripture.
Yeah. You want to keep avoiding me and keep acting like we're not going to talk about the real thing, then I got nothing for you. I can't work with you. So I think that's what happens for us when we get real with the Lord. And I don't care how painful it is, meaning a lot of my grief came out as anger, but the Lord never shamed me for that. He never turned me away. It was almost as if he absorbed all of my pain because he knew where it was coming from. And it wasn't just the death of my husband. It was the death of childhood. It was the death of things that I had to go through and process. So he understood. I felt like he understood it. And so, but once I got to the point where this processing became obvious to me that I could not lift my hand. There was nothing I could do or a resource I could have that would change my situation, because the one who could have stopped my husband's death did not. And so I had to face the fact that the good God I profess did not intervene in my husband's death. And so what do you say to God, the good God I profess? What do you say to him at that point? And so when that became my reality, it collided with God's sovereignty. And at that point, I submitted to God's sovereignty. I chose to just lay it down. But when I did, submission with God has got to be one of the most powerful things there is, because that's when healing began to happen for me, is when I laid down the argument, because I had rights, right? I mean, I wasn't making up my situation. I had rights.
And where was he? That's a great question, right? He was right there.
Where was he? Yeah, right there, engaged. And I think that's another thing too that people miss, that even when we do not use our gift of choice in the way that God intended for us to do it, God's still in there. He would never ever let you endure those things by yourself. Yes, people are making the wrong choice. Yes, he is heartbroken over what they're doing, but he ain't going to let you be there by yourself and go through it alone. And I think people miss that, because it's such a beautiful thing to know that we're never alone. Because if I could strip humanity down to one thing, you like take all the little ways that we protect ourselves and the way we make things look and our vices and whatnot, and we strip it down, it's the fear of being alone, being left alone, abandoned. I think that's where, because we were created for relationship.
Right.
And so that's why Satan takes that as such a powerful weapon. But God comes along and rewrites it, saying, I was right there. There was an incident I shared with you, and if I'm talking too much, just let me know. But there was an incident that I shared with you about that the reason I had abandonment issues with my mother. She would always threaten to leave you. She would always threaten that you do that, I'm going to leave you right here. Well, she did one day. She left me there for a couple of hours with my brother. And so we're walking along the side of the road trying to think. I mean, I was trusting my brother. He's a year older, so I'm thinking he knows where he's going. I think he's heading home. When all of a sudden she pulls up, and we get in the car. So her threats became very real to me. And so I began to have a reoccurring dream of her leaving me various places. And it was just a fear of mine that I had for many years. And I asked the Lord through some theophostic prayer counseling. And I said, where were you? Like, where were you in that moment that changed my life? And he gave me a vision. I'm getting a little soft-hearted here, but he gave me a vision. And that he was walking beside me, and he had his hand on my back, in the middle of my back. And he's looking down to me like he's either talking to me or caring for me in some way. And that healed my abandonment issues. And I'm not saying, I feel like it's the last piece of abandonment, but if I get triggered again, then that just means I have some more healing to bring to him, to talk to him about it. But that one vision healed years of abandonment issues.
Oh, that's so precious.
It was. It really was.
So precious. And it's just the faithfulness of our God, who we don't understand. I say so many times, probably one of the most recited verses on my podcast is Hebrews 4:15, where the Bible says, we do not serve a high priest who is unfamiliar with our sufferings. And so for me, when I got into the where were you could have, and even Sherrie thinking you were there, you watched. And the vision that the Lord gave me, and this has been many years ago, is Jesus hanging on the cross and his Father having to turn his back on him. And then just that understanding of Hebrews 4:15, that we do not serve a high priest who doesn't get being abandoned. You know what I'm saying? Jesus, as far as we know, had a decent childhood, so no childhood trauma going on there, but he absolutely understands our suffering. Well, I feel like I've been to church today. It's not very often on my own podcast that I walk away with my cup filled. But you are the host of a podcast called Finding God in Our Pain. And I think that you have absolutely found God in your pain. I had the great honor of being on your podcast. And we will put how to contact Sherrie into the show notes. And so as we close here, Sherrie, you will hear this when the podcast drops, but there is a song by Phil Baker called Marked by You that he has allowed me to use, and your life is marked by him. And so before I finish up here, Chrissy, do you have any final parting words for our guest here, Sherrie, and for my buddy?
What an amazing story. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Do you feel, because Chrissy and I are kind of going through some stuff, do you feel like God just...
Yeah.
I love you through Sherrie Pilkington today. Yes. I really do. I really do.
Well, thank you, ladies, for allowing me to be part of my redemption story, because I believe that being able to turn around and extend your hand out to someone else, or give somebody a heart hug along the way after sharing what you've learned. I believe that's us taking part in our redemption story.
Thank you. And it is Joel 2:25, another verse so often recited, that the Lord will restore the years that the locusts have stolen. And I'm just so grateful that you refuse to continue to not believe the lie. And so thank you so much for being here today. You are an incredible steward of your pain. I want to thank you for your vulnerability here today. It really is my hope that listeners out there, no matter where you are in the world, will find hope. Because there is hope in Sherrie's story, even though there's plenty of pain, because she found God in her pain and found him to be the only analgesic that sticks for her pain. That doesn't mean that life is easy, but in the body of pain of her life, she is proving the truth of Philippians 1:6, where God promised, Paul writes, that he will finish that which he started in our life. Sherrie's life also embodies one of my favorite verses. I just mentioned it, Joel 2:25, where we see God redeeming all of the years that the locusts have stolen. We're behind microphones, both of us, all the time, him redeeming the years that the locusts have stolen. Finally, it is my hope that in this episode has highlighted the importance of community, paying attention to Sherrie, the Sherries of the world, the Amy's of the world, and the Susies of the world, and the Johnnies of the world, those experiencing trauma or adverse childhood experience and need your help. Guys, early intervention is so important in healing the negative effects of trauma on the developing brain. Who knows how much less traumatic this loss in Sherrie's life would have been had she not had to work through a process with God on being abandoned. So as we head out of here, we'll be back in 2 weeks. It is my prayer that if your story is like Sherrie's and you have not gotten help, that you would seek that help today, either through our efforts here to provide pro bono counseling. You can contact me with that Contact Amy link, or through your own efforts. You don't have to live in misery and activated all the time. While childhood trauma can and often does leave lifetime effects, it is never too late to get better. Finally, it is my prayer that Sherrie's story will help you pay attention to children in your life. Step in as a community when you feel that you can help. I'm talking youth pastors, parents, teachers, friends. Children are the most precious humans. They aren't little adults. They need us protecting them. Can you imagine a Sherrie or an Amy with somebody that would come up and protect us? Can you imagine what we would have not had to walk through? When we do this, we equip it. Finally, for you parents out there, you've not screwed up your children, I promise. This is for those 10 adverse childhood experiences, not you just yelling at them because they're throwing stuff at each other in the car. We want healthy people walking around. We know that the star of the story, who is Jesus, is the only one that accomplishes that for us. If you don't know the star of the story, I would love to share him with you, and I know Sherrie would too. Both of our contact information is in the show notes. We are honored, I am honored in having a voice to tell people about the God who heals, the God who sees, the God who provides. And Sherrie, I'm going to speak over to you what I speak over everybody, what I speak over to Chrissy, what I speak over to myself, and what I speak to my listeners all around the world, 7 continents. Guys, you are seen, you are known, you are heard, you are loved, and you are valued. And we'll see you back here in 2 weeks in the Healing Zone. Thank you, Sherrie.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Let my life glorify you and teach me to walk beside you.